Well, a community is a group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic or interest in common. A marriage or partnership or friendship between 2 or 3 people can be a community. So much of my life has been centered around community. First and foremost, I grew up in a family of 6 kids, and that is a community. When I was really young, my stepdad sailed, and we spent time at the yacht club, another kind of community. I went to a small school from 4th to 8th grade, and that was a community. Sports, leadership, college, seminary, churches, colleagues, organizing work, friend groups. The list goes on in terms of the numbers of communities I have been a part of. Not every community has been healthy or functional or life-giving or transformative. Carson, one of our younger folks here, and I had a conversation about worship themes this summer, and she mentioned she thought that community could be a good and helpful theme. How does community happen? What makes community hospitable? When does community feel like family, and what are the challenges inherent in that? How does care happen in community? How do people in a community help shape a community? We're going to be exploring several of these themes in the coming weeks, beginning with today's theme of how communities begin and develop. Over the past few weeks, after Carson and I had this conversation, I've been thinking more about community. I feel deeply grateful and incredibly lucky to get to be part of this community here in this congregation at this time in the history of this congregation. You all are one of the healthiest and most visionary congregations I've ever been a part of or served in my 32 years. We're not perfect, but we are connected in deep ways. That's not the way every community lives. And as I've been thinking about you all in particular and what it is that is at the heart of functional, healthy, life-giving communities, there was one word that kept coming up for me over and over and over again. The word is intentional. Communities don't just pop up or even stay as healthy or unhealthy, functional or dysfunctional, generous or stingy, competitive or collaborative, visionary or stuck, exclusionary or inclusive, welcoming or tight-knit and closed. Even in churches, I just lost my place. Here we go. Like people, communities are formed, and that formation begins with intentionality. If intention doesn't continue, communities often change quickly. In churches, we can see that with the change of a pastor, or a change in leadership with elders, or even just new people arriving or some people leaving. Even one person joining or leaving can change the dynamic of a congregation. If a community is intentional in how it lives and in what kind of community it wants to be, there is a better chance that it will be life-giving and not harmful. While the Bible says lots of things about how we are to live together, one of the passages that gives a clear image is the one Louise read this morning in 1 Corinthians 12. We're given a metaphor. The church is like a body with all of its various parts. For many of us, this text is familiar and has been used to illustrate many different ideas. It is sometimes interpreted as a hierarchical text with Christ as the head and the church as the various body parts. I don't think that's what the text was intending. Instead, this text was in part a commentary against the dominant and hierarchical culture where Rome was the head and all others were parts that had to submit to Rome. Instead, the author here is giving a radical image for how society and culture and community is meant to be. It's meant to be a place where all are valued and important and considered necessary and allowed to live into their various gifts and functions. And the ones with the least amount of respect should be given the most respect, like our little toe or something like that. When churches and denominations formed into hierarchical organizations, it was a failure of this very important depiction of community. So if the ideal presented here is to be the kind of community where it doesn't matter who you are, what you do, where you have come from, how old you are, your identities, whether or not you are new or have been attending for 50 years, how does that kind of community develop? Especially when we think about not setting aside or ignoring all of these identities, but bringing them in and saying, all are necessary. How do we get to that kind of community? What do our intentions need to be? One of the most important aspects of an intentional community is how that community communicates. Communication is the absolute foundation of any house to be built, to use another image. Even the smallest kind of community, like a marriage or partnership or family, no matter the size, all the way up to the largest of communities, all have to be built on a foundation of honest, assertive, and nonviolent communication. As soon as there is secrecy or withholding or deception or passive-aggressive communication or aggressive communication, there's a breakdown in community. When people in a community refuse to address a person or group they are having difficulty with and instead go around telling others in the community what they're upset about, there's a breakdown in community. In the church world, we call that having parking lot meetings. When something happens in a church and no one will speak up either in that moment or to that person or in a particular meeting, but then go out and talk at will to many others in the parking lot about it, that's a parking lot meeting, and it's often a sign of illness in a community. This can easily happen in friend groups and families, and anywhere where there are more than two people. It's not only important that people know how to communicate, it's also important that they're not afraid to, and that they know how to communicate directly. Over the years, I've studied systems and how systems that are healthy become unhealthy, and one of the keys is how that system communicates. It's patterns of communication. During my first year here in this congregation, it quickly became apparent that there was a mismatch between me and the music director, who was here at the time and had been here for several years. His vision of what church music should be and mine were polar opposites. I met with him weekly and shared with him how I wanted the music to change. We would talk about it, and then he'd go out of the meeting and do nothing of what I had asked. Week after week after week, this went on. I would often sit in church and feel as though I was at a funeral. I communicated with him very directly about this. You know how direct I can be without being mean. He wouldn't say much in our meetings, and then he'd go and do the opposite for worship. Things came to a head that next spring, and he ended up leaving quite abruptly just before Easter. Because he had been here a while, he was beloved by some in the congregation. I knew his leaving would upset a few people, so I called for an informational congregational meeting. Along with the personnel committee, I gave as many details as I could without violating confidentiality, and then we all had a conversation. There were times in that conversation when things got a little heated. When people expressed anger, I tried to stay calm, but I also shared when comments that were said felt hurtful to me. The reason I think about that almost 10 years later is because I believe it laid a kind of foundation for how we were going to be community together. As hard as it can be to have open and honest conversations, they tend to take away the fear, the anger, the confusion, and the tendency to have conversation all over and with everyone except the people who need to be having the conversation. Many of us were brought up in family systems who didn't deal well with conflict. Often our families were either too aggressive or loud or mean when conflict was happening, or our families would let things fester until someone exploded and there was a sense that conflict was bad or meant we were bad, or conflict was completely ignored, or at least everyone pretended it didn't exist. My family wasn't the greatest with conflict. To say we had knockdown, drag-out fights is a bit of an understatement. I won't go into details, but suffice it to say that fighting was the normal way of communication. When I got involved in leadership as a high school student, I learned an entirely different way of communicating. It changed my life. It doesn't mean I could always use it in my family, but I did try with them, and I still try with them to communicate in that way. What it did mean, though, is that I sought to use it in communities I was a part of. When I was a sophomore in college and playing volleyball, I was made the captain of my team, which was a bit unusual since I was just a sophomore. But I'm convinced the reason I was named captain was because of how I communicated with my teammates and our coaches. I tell you this because we often bring what we learned from our families, healthy or not, into our community experiences. When a community is intentional about how it communicates, we can learn whole new ways of being in community. Intentionality requires not being afraid to speak honestly to someone in the community who is hurting you or others if you see it. In my 32 years of ministry, I've seen repeatedly what happens when even one person is allowed to get away with what we think of as bully behavior. When one person is demanding or insisting on their way or no way, even that can harm community life. It doesn't mean that person needs to go. It simply means that person needs to be communicated with directly so they can understand the impact of their behavior. Very few people, especially in churches, intend to harm others. But as we all know, our impact can be different from our intention. While conflict is at one end of a spectrum, the other end of the spectrum in communities is the experience of feeling ignored or neglected or unappreciated, or as though you simply don't belong. When I eventually retire at some point, I think I'm going to look back on my ministry and wish that all of the people who wanted me to read their minds, and when I couldn't, felt as though I or others didn't care, would have chosen instead to communicate with me about their feelings of being left out or uncared for or forgotten. It pains me to think that someone or anyone would think I simply didn't care. In my first call out of seminary, I remember being flabbergasted when I would ask someone why they were upset, and they would tell me it was because I didn't visit them when, and you can fill in the blanks. And I would say, but I never knew that happened. And they would say, well, you should have. And that was in a 2,000-member church. But even in my time here, we've had some people who have left this church who are angry about something and never expressed to me why or what it was that I or someone else did or said. If I could change anything about people or communities, it would be this: to leave a community without ever saying why or speaking directly to the person or people who you feel harmed by is a lack of courage and a lack of commitment to that community. That is not the kind of community I want to be a part of, because when someone leaves, it is a loss to the community if you are intentional about building relationship. For someone to leave without saying goodbye or saying why they are leaving is a break in relationship. All of this is to say that if you're feeling a little bit disconnected here, or maybe a lot disconnected, or if you're disappointed about something I or someone else has said or done, or if you're feeling like you're just an outsider here or neglected, please let me know so we can talk about it, because that is absolutely not our intent, and we can hear that it is the impact. I can assure you that I and others care enough about you to want to know how you are feeling and how we can help you get reconnected, unless you simply want a reason to leave this community. And in that case, there isn't much that any of us can do. Each week we send out our weekly e-newsletter on Wednesdays. No matter how busy I am or how full my week is, I make sure to take time to write to you in that newsletter. Part of why I prioritize that is because it's a good way to communicate with you all at once about some very important things going on here at church, both inside of our doors and outside of our doors. I would like to encourage more of you to prioritize reading it. Some of you don't read it, and then you feel as though you aren't in the loop on some things, or as though communication is only happening with some. I'm sure I miss details about some of the things going on, but I try hard to focus on the things you really need to know. Some weeks, if there are things you are reading that you don't understand or disagree with, let's talk about it. My door is always open, though these days it is good to check in with me about my schedule. And I do absolutely want to hear from you. Many of you have done that over the years, and I think it's one of the reasons we have a healthy community. Even though I'm speaking in the first person, I want to clarify that this is not just about me. In an intentional community where all voices are equally important, everyone needs to feel free to communicate with each other. In every community you are a part of, you will naturally be drawn to some people more than others. I am closer to some siblings than to other siblings. That's natural. What isn't natural is thinking that it's okay to be in relationship with some and then be completely cut off from others. I've been in churches where people have not been speaking to each other. In systems theory, that is one of the signs of an unhealthy system. It's okay not to like someone in the system. It's okay not to want to spend time outside of church with someone in the system. When you get to the level of a complete cutoff, that can be harmful to a system. The exception to that, and there is an exception, is when abuse of any kind has occurred or is occurring. In that case, a cutoff relationship can be a necessary boundary. If that has happened in your family or a close community you are a part of, you know it can be awkward at times. The key is honest and direct communication about it. In one church I served, and it was a small church, smaller than this church, there were cut-off relationships throughout the community, but no one, including me as the pastor, really knew why, because people were keeping secrets. It took me a couple of years of persistence to figure it all out and get to the truth. Communication is at the heart of every community, and it is the foundation for how a community is formed, as well as how it continues to grow or not. Our intentionality about communication is one of the most important things we can do in the formation of the kind of community we want. I want you to think for a minute about 3 of the most important communities you are a part of. Give me a signal when you have 3 communities in your mind. Now I want you to think about how you tend to communicate in each of those 3 communities. How often do you communicate honestly and directly in those 3 communities you're thinking of? Several years ago, we held a one-day workshop here on nonviolent communication led by Dr. Teresa Latini. I started leading assertive communication workshops when I was in high school, so I assumed I wouldn't learn much or that there wouldn't be anything new. A lot of it was repeat information for me, but there was one step in nonviolent communication that I had never learned. Before making a clear request of someone, you are supposed to take time to identify your unmet need. That one step was absolutely transformative. I can't tell you how often I communicate with others, directly, assertively, honestly, nonviolently, including my spouse, without really understanding what my unmet need is. Sometimes I think humanity is kind of like the walking dead when it comes to this piece. We walk around like zombies, and even though we may communicate, If we do it without knowing what our unmet need is, we're still missing it. So let's go back to this community for a minute. What are your needs related to this community here at this church? And which of those needs are unmet? Identifying unmet needs is personally one of my most difficult tasks. I often don't know what I need. The same might be true for you. What would happen if we began asking each other, even in the midst of conversations, what do you need? The communities I am a part of are very important to me. As I get older, I recognize my time is not unlimited, and so I want to spend my time wisely. I don't want to spend time in communities that don't value and prioritize and create intention around communication. What about you? What kinds of communities do you want to spend your time in? Let's continue to be intentional about communicating with each other here in this community. Amen.